Hello everyone, welcome back to the Doctrine, Dogma, and Davide podcast. My name is Davide, and today I want to talk a little bit about the question of, can the Catholic Church change its teachings? I think that this is a question that has come up a lot lately, in part because of the so-called German synodal way, as well as the Synod on Synodality that Pope Francis has organized. And the answer is a little bit more complicated than you might expect. It kind of depends on what you mean by change, and quite frankly, what you mean by teaching. Because the Church has a variety of different types of teachings, as well as a variety of different ways of sort of expounding and promulgating those teachings. So the Catholic Church has three types of teachings. There are doctrines, dogmas, and disciplines. Doctrines and dogmas are formal teachings of the Church that cannot technically be changed at all. Whereas disciplines are more so like policies that are put in place to help to assist the faithful in following Christ and in abiding by the teachings of the Church. An example of a dogma would be that Jesus Christ is truly God and truly man, that he is one person with two natures, human and divine, and that his human and divine natures coexist in the person of Jesus Christ without mixture, mingling, or confusion. So that's a dogma, and it's sort of like the highest level of teaching within the Church. There is no changing, no reinterpreting, there is no wiggle room, really, on a dogma, because a dogma is a teaching of the Church that has been clarified and made specific and explicit. You can identify dogmas if you read an ecumenical council pretty easily, because a lot of times they will, in addition to very clearly expounding the teaching of the Church, they will explicitly say that if anyone disagrees with this, if anyone opposes this teaching, let them be anathema, let them be cast out. And so a dogma is a doctrine that has been clarified and made more specific, whereas a doctrine is a teaching of the Church that has not been clarified or made super specific. An example of this, for instance, would be the doctrine of the true presence before the Council of Trent. Before the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church had always taught that, Jesus Christ is truly present in the Eucharist, but the exact nature of how that happens and the specifics of it were not clarified into a dogma until the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was when the dogma of transubstantiation was articulated, that the bread and wine at the Mass are no longer bread and wine once they've been consecrated, but they are truly the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And the words body, blood, soul, and divinity actually come directly from the Council of Trent when this dogma was being proclaimed. The true presence, that Jesus Christ is truly present in the Eucharist, that was always taught by the Church, but that was then clarified, the debate over exactly how that happens and the exact nature of how that happens in the Eucharist was clarified, defined, and the debate was settled at the Council of Trent. Another example would be the doctrine that Mary was sinless. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that she committed no personal sin, or does that mean that she was conceived without original sin? Was she born without original sin? The Church has always taught that Mary was sinless, but, for instance, Thomas Aquinas argued that Mary was cleansed of her original sin in utero immediately after her conception, and then lived a sinless life. So St. Thomas Aquinas believed that Mary lived a sinless life, committed no personal sin, but that she very momentarily had original sin when it was washed away in the womb. So the doctrine of Mary's sinless life was always taught by the Church, but then the Immaculate Conception was dogmatically proclaimed by Blessed Pius IX right before the First Vatican Council, where he proclaimed that Mary was preserved from original sin from the very first moment of her existence, that she never at any point of her existence ever had any trace of original sin. And so the main difference between a doctrine and a dogma, they're both infallible teachings of the Church, but dogmas are much more specific and doctrines are a little bit more broad. And so with doctrines, there's a little bit more space, there's a little bit more wiggle room for theologians to argue about the details of that doctrine. So then we get to disciplines. Disciplines, like I said, are policies of the Church that are there to assist the faithful, but are not infallible teachings of the Church. And so disciplines can actually be changed at will, according to the discretion of the Holy Father, the Pope, as well as the bishops, insofar as the Pope gives them the discretion over certain disciplinary matters. An example of a discipline would be the prohibition against eating meat on Fridays during Lent. or the requirement that people fast for an hour before receiving the Eucharist. Previously, the church required people to fast for 3 hours before receiving the Eucharist, and that fast was reduced. Previously, it was required to abstain from meat every Friday of the year, not just during Lent. But at the Second Vatican Council, they changed the discipline to allow people to substitute some sort of different other penance during the rest of the year outside of Lent. Which, by the way, actually a lot of Catholics don't realize that they still have to do some sort of penance every Friday, and that the Friday penances are not just during Lent. But outside of Lent, you just get to choose your penance. You still have to do penance every Friday. Another example of a discipline would actually be clerical celibacy. So the policy that priests are not allowed to get married or to be married is actually a discipline of the church. It's not a doctrine. So if, according to the Pope's discretion, he wished to adjust the discipline of the church to allow priests to become married, that is something that he could absolutely do. Now, I wouldn't expect that to happen. I think that there are very good reasons that clerical celibacy is still in place. There are practical reasons and also spiritual reasons. But in theory, the matter of discipline, ultimately, the authority over the disciplines of the church, they ultimately rest with the Pope. And so the Pope can change those policies and those disciplines. What he cannot change are the doctrines and dogmas of the church. One analogy that I like to use is, imagine you're in a classroom and you're taking a math class. The teacher will teach you many things. He will teach you that 2 plus 2 equals 4. He might also teach you to raise your hand before speaking in class. He might also teach you not to eat in class. Now, if you ask your professor, hey, can we speak without raising our hand? Can we change that teaching? Can we change the teaching on eating in class? Because, our class is right before lunch and we're hungry. The teacher might consider changing those teachings, those policies, because those policies were put in place by the teacher to assist in the learning of the subject matter. But if you ask the teacher, hey, can we change the teaching on whether 2 plus 2 actually equals 4? Your teacher's going to say no, because that is not a matter of policy, it's a matter of teaching. And the professor has no more authority to change the teaching of math than the church has to change the teachings on the doctrines. Another analogy that I like to use sometimes is, imagine you have a convention of physicists. You have a bunch of American physicists, they come together and they have a convention and they discuss matters of physics. And somebody comes along and he says, hey, at this convention, can we change the teaching on gravity? I think that the acceleration due to gravity at the Earth's surface is too high. 9.8 meters per second squared, that's too much acceleration. People fall, they get hurt. Can we at least entertain the conversation of just reducing that to maybe 6 meters per second squared? It would save so many lives, people wouldn't fall so hard. I think that it would be a really beneficial change. The physicists would laugh you out of the room because they don't control that. They discover what the laws of physics are, they measure them, and then they teach them. That is the purpose of a physicist. In much the same way, the church's job is not to decide what it is going to teach, but rather, the church's job is to study the deposit of faith that was left to the church by Christ and faithfully teach it. And the way it goes about teaching what has been revealed might change here and there according to the age. But the essential truths being taught, they cannot change. The church has no more authority to change its doctrines than the physicists do to change the force of gravity. It was not their invention, and they cannot decide what it is to be. And this is actually something that the First Vatican Council actually talked a little bit about. It stated, quote, "For the doctrine of the faith which God has revealed has not been proposed like a philosophical invention to be perfected by human ingenuity. Rather, it has been delivered as a divine deposit to the spouse of Christ to be faithfully kept and infallibly declared. Hence also that meaning of the sacred dogmas is perpetually to be retained, which our Holy Mother the Church has once declared. Nor is that meaning ever to be departed from, under the pretense or pretext of a deeper comprehension of them. Let then the intelligence, science, and wisdom of each and all of individuals and of the whole Church in all ages and at all times increase and flourish in abundance and vigor, but simply in its own proper kind. That is to say, one in the same doctrine, one in the same sense, one in the same judgment." Vatican I also goes on to state, quote, "If anyone shall assert it to be possible that sometimes, according to the progress of science, a sense is to be given to doctrines propounded by the Church different from that which the Church has understood and understands, let him be anathema." And so the First Vatican Council very clearly articulated and expounded the dogma that the Church's teachings are not human inventions, they're not things that we can tinker with or refine. Ultimately, the teachings of the Church were given to us by God and clarified and preserved by the magisterium of the Church. And these pronouncements of Vatican I make things a little awkward, I think, for the German synodal way. Now, I do want to make the clarification that the German synodal way is different from Pope Francis's Synod on Synodality. They're different things, but they have similar names. Now, the German synodal way has created a lot of controversy because it is openly called for a change in the Church's teachings, especially around the areas of, say, human sexuality and whether or not women can be ordained as priests. These are not things that are disciplines, just to be clear. These are doctrines of the Church. So when the German Church actually says things like, the science has progressed and we now understand, say, homosexuality better, and so the Church needs to change its teachings accordingly, Vatican I directly contradicts that and says that it doesn't really matter what the science finds. The science cannot dictate morality. The science cannot dictate the Church's doctrines and teachings. The fact of the matter is, no finding of science can ever contradict the infallible teachings of the Church, because truth cannot contradict truth. Their argument that the Church's teaching on homosexuality ought to be changed because we now understand that same-sex attractions are not, chosen, they are innate. It doesn't change the Church's teachings on the integrity of the sexual act, that you cannot separate the unitive and procreative aspects of the sexual act, and that the different sexes are meant to be complementary in sexuality and in marriage. Ultimately, no finding of science can change that, because that is the truth. Ultimately, when it comes to the infallible teachings of the Church, the doctrines and dogmas, you cannot appeal to science as a means of changing what the Church has always taught. Once again, as Vatican I states, quote, "Therefore all faithful Christians are not only forbidden to defend as legitimate conclusions of science such opinions as are known to be contrary to the doctrines of the faith, especially if they have been condemned by the Church, but are altogether bound to account them as errors which put on the fallacious appearance of truth." So when it comes to the question of, can this teaching of the Church change? You have to ask, is it a doctrine? Is it a dogma? Or is it a discipline? If it's a discipline, then yes, it can be changed, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. Oftentimes, the disciplines of the Church are informed by sort of the small t tradition of the Church, and there's good reasons for them to be in place that should not be swept aside lightly. If it's a doctrine or a dogma, the answer is no, they cannot be changed. But if it's a doctrine that hasn't been formally clarified, there might be some wiggle room and some room for debate about exactly what the nature of that teaching is and what the extent of its implications are. So that's sort of the answer to the question of, can the Church change its teaching? The long answer is, sort of. It depends on what you mean by teaching and what you mean by change. But the short answer is pretty much no. Because just like Vatican I said, the doctrine of the faith, which God has revealed, has not been proposed like a philosophical invention to be perfected by human ingenuity. It was not something we came up with. It was something that God gave to us. This is divine revelation. And the Church's job is to teach what God has taught. So I think that just about does it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was spiritually fruitful for you. If it was, go ahead and like, comment, do whatever it is that people of the internet do, and I will see you all next week. God bless.